The roots of the D.C. National Guard are older than the United States, older than the active duty military, and older than the District of Columbia itself. Even before there was a District of Columbia, citizen soldiers had formed militia units in Georgetown and Bladensburg. These units would fight in the American War of Independence and participated in every conflict thereafter, including World War I in France and Germany, World War II in the South Pacific and Europe, the Vietnam conflict, and the global war on terrorism in Iraq and Afghanistan. It was in 1802 President Thomas Jefferson created the D.C. National Guard, the only National Guard with a federal mission to protect the nation's capital. However, it wasn't until the War of 1812 that Congress fully backed having a military presence in the nation's capital. Prior to 1812, the D.C. militia was ill-equipped and had to rely heavily on Maryland and Virginia. With Maryland and Virginia preoccupied with attacks on their own states, the D.C. militia were overwhelmed and forced to watch the capital burn from the bluffs of Georgetown. But perhaps the War of 1812 produced one of the most famous veterans of the D.C. National Guard, Francis Scott Key, a lieutenant with the Georgetown Artillery. Key went to Maryland during the British bombardment of the Baltimore Harbor to negotiate a prisoner exchange. After the negotiation, the ship's commander felt Key had seen too much and had to stay on ship through the rest of the attack. As he watched the flag fly over Fort McHenry, Key wrote the poem that became the Star-Spangled Banner, our national anthem. At the beginning of the Civil War, Washington, D.C. was surrounded by enemy territory. 3 days before shots fired at Fort Sumter initiated the war, President Lincoln called up the D.C. militia to protect the nation's capital, making it the first man, the first regiment, the first company called to duty in the Civil War. After the Civil War years, public support for the D.C. National Guard was at a new high. Encampments were held on the National Mall. Parades and marching competitions were popular spectator events, and the rifle team was nationally known. John Philip Sousa, the March King, composed 2 marches for D.C. Guard units. From 1898 to 1917, the citizen soldiers of the D.C. National Guard included sailors. In 1915, the Naval Battalion established an aeronautical corps that employed civilian experience to train aviators for World War I. After the ships were called to active naval service during the war, the battalion never reformed. Fearing espionage, the D.C. National Guard was called to service 17 days before the U.S. officially entered World War I. In 1917, the first separate regiment was mustered into service and renamed the 372nd Infantry. The active duty military, unsure of what to do with the all-African American regiment, attached it to the French Army's 157th, the Red Hand Division. The soldiers fought in Meuse-Argonne, Lorraine, and Alsace, where they were awarded the Croix de Guerre, one of the highest honors of the French military. General Victor Courbet, commanding officer of the 157th Red Hand Division, praised the 372nd, saying, "To the officers, non-commissioned officers, and soldiers of the 372nd Infantry, I respectfully salute your glorious dead, and I bow before your banners which conducted us to victory." In an embrace of the tradition, the 372nd Military Police Battalions used Red Hand as the standard call sign to this day. During World War II, the Guard was called into action across the country to provide experience and leadership to a military rapidly filling with draftees. One of the most famous units, the 121st Engineers, was split into two units, the 117th, who served proudly in the Pacific Theater, and the 121st Engineer Combat Battalion, which was one of the first units at the beaches of Normandy on D-Day. The roots of our air unit served in Africa and Italy, proudly touching every corner of the globe. At the end of World War II, the D.C. National Guard faced the enormous task of restructuring and retraining. The ensuing Cold War years marked a new wave of the Guard's relationship with the military. In 1947, the Air Force was designated as a separate branch of the military. The D.C. Air National Guard became a reality in 1950 when the 113th Wing received federal recognition. In 1951, the D.C. Army National Guard 715th Truck Company became one of the few Guard units to mobilize to the Korean War. The 113th Wing spent a year activated in support of the Berlin Crisis in 1961. And were activated again in 1968 by President Lyndon Johnson in response to the Pueblo crisis with North Korea. During the Vietnam War, fear that the National Guard call-up would prove unpopular kept most Guardsmen out of the fight and ultimately changed the way Americans viewed the Guard. However, as part of the levied replacement program, Air National Guard pilots were deployed individually. The 113th Wing sent F-100C pilots to conflict, including Colonel Sherman Flanagan, who died when his aircraft was shot down over the demilitarized zone dividing North and South Vietnam. On the morning of September 11, 2001, the 113th Wing D.C. Air National Guard received instructions from the White House to get F-16s in the air. The Pentagon had just been hit, and the White House knew another U.S. airliner had been hijacked. The 113th Wing scrambled with orders to deter all aircraft within 20 miles of D.C. with whatever force is necessary to keep from hitting a building downtown. There was no time to arm the F-16s. Each fighter went out with only 500 bullets each, enough for a 5-second burst. Unsure if there were more hostile aircraft, each pilot committed to doing whatever necessary to stop hostile aircraft, including ramming. After the threat had passed, fighters from Langley and the National Guard worked together to escort aircraft out of D.C. airspace. In 2013, the unit was recognized as one of the busiest in the nation, exceeding 4,000 alert missions, more than any other 15 similar units nationwide combined. Since then, the Guard has supported the global war on terror. More than 1,200 soldiers and airmen were deployed overseas. Units have completed more than 90 deployments and served faithfully and honorably in several countries, including Iraq, Afghanistan, Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, Saudi Arabia, and Abu Dhabi. More than just a reserve force, the D.C. National Guard retains a mission to protect the District of Columbia. They hold their guard posts not only during the time of war, but have protected Americans in time of civil unrest and natural disaster. During the 1960s, unprecedented numbers of Americans came to Washington to demonstrate. The D.C. National Guard was activated during several anti-war and civil rights demonstrations, including after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. in 1968. The Guard maintains this tradition of local service and continues to build on its long-standing history of serving the community. By providing security for city and national events, deploying in the wake of severe weather storms like Hurricane Katrina, or providing ceremonial support for celebrations, the D.C. National Guard constantly proves it's ready to be called upon. The D.C. National Guard has been at every presidential inauguration, starting with an honor detail that rode with President Washington in 1789. In 1860, following the election of Abraham Lincoln, the D.C. militia was ordered to protect the president-elect from harm. as no Secret Service had been formed at that time.
Militia guarded the parade route, sappers preceded the president-elect, and cavalry rode alongside Lincoln, bucking their horses to make it difficult for snipers to get a lock.
The new president gave his first salute to a D.C. Guardsman, and a tradition was born. In 2009, the D.C. National Guard led a group of 9,000 National Guardsmen to support the largest inauguration in history, providing traffic control, crowd management, public transit assistance, and marching in the parade. The National Guard provides support to the community every day. But the D.C. National Guard began to invest in youth more directly in 1968 with the first Youth Leaders Camp.
In 1993, the National Guard Youth Challenge Program was created to give high school dropouts another chance at success. The D.C. National Guard Capitol Guardian Youth Challenge Academy opened the doors to a brand new facility in 2013, dedicated to inspiring a new generation of educated and disciplined young people. At home and abroad, the D.C. National Guard is a living legacy of service to the nation and service to the community. We are the Capitol Guardians, guardians for defense.